John Mearsheimer is a doyen of offensive realism, a variant of neo-realist IR theory that suggests that states must continually seek to maximise their material power in order to be secure in a world where war and conflict are ever present. Known widely for his intellectually combative nature, his writings have often courted political controversy or stirred up fervent scholarly debates in their wake. The False Promise of International Institutions is one such article that stimulated a wave of intellectual sparring between Mearsheimer and those who decried what they saw as his narrow and at times inaccurate take on major institutional theories in IR, particularly neoliberal institutionalism, which holds that states have rational interests in cooperating with one another and that international organisations are key arenas through which such cooperation can be facilitated. The 1995 article titled The Promise of Institutionalist Theory was one of a number of responses to Mearsheimer's article that took issue with his analysis and conclusions. It was co-authored by Robert Keohane, known as a founding father of neoliberal institutionalism, and Lisa Martin. The response critiques what the authors called the fallacious logic of realism, before disputing key claims Mearsheimer makes in his article related to neoliberal institutionalism and the role and impact of institutions in international relations. It provides important insights into how neoliberal institutionalists differ themselves from neo-realists, underscores the relevance of institutional theory to security issues and to situations where relative gains, that is, one state gaining or benefiting more than others, matters. Together, Mearsheimer's and Keohane and Martin's articles provide an excellent understanding of the debate between two mainstream theoretical approaches, neorealism and neoliberal institutionalism, on the questions of whether or not and how international institutions matter, particularly in terms of contributing to peace and stability in international relations. Both share key foundational assumptions around states being rational egoists who pursue their self-interests in order to survive in an anarchic international system. By anarchy, we mean a lack of world government or higher authority than states. Yet each comes to a very different conclusion about why states cooperate, under what conditions, and the role and impact of international institutions in this context. The False Promise represents Mearsheimer's attempt at shattering what he sees as the illusion of international institutions having any meaningful impact on the prospect of avoiding war and promoting peace and stability in the international system. For him, three key theories in IR were mainly responsible for propping up this false promise: liberal institutionalism, collective security, and critical theory. Collective security is an approach which suggests that states must renounce the use of force and accept that the security of one is the concern of all. Critical theory broadly describes a range of different theories and approaches generally unified by a focus on norms and discourses and on changing the world for the better. Mearsheimer's article is devoted to using a neo-realist perspective to expose what he saw as flaws riddling the causal logic of each of these theories. The timing of the article, coming only 4 years after the end of the Cold War, was significant. It was a time in international politics where international institutions were being heralded as having an important role in promoting peace and stability in the world by policymakers and academics alike. Mearsheimer's article was a direct and bold attempt at decimating this view. Within the academic discipline of international relations, it was a time when theories such as critical theory and feminist approaches to international relations were finding increasing resonance amongst academics who, amongst other things, rejected realism's narrow and pessimistic outlook and wanted to develop new ways of thinking that could help change the world for the better. In The False Promise, Mearsheimer seeks to seriously undermine the intellectual credibility of the theories that he critiques and argues that policies based on thinking espoused by them are bound to fail. In their 1995 response to The False Promise, Keohane and Martin take up the task of rebutting Mearsheimer's major claims around the flaws, according to him, in the causal logic of liberal institutionalism. The authors first point out the logical inconsistencies in Mearsheimer's own realist position, and then counterclaims he makes about liberal institutionalism that they argue are simply not correct. These relate mainly to how Mearsheimer characterises liberal institutionalism as being interested only in economic issues, at the cost of overlooking security issues, and how institutionalists only focus on the threat of cheating when thinking about how to remove obstacles to interstate cooperation, at the cost of overlooking the question of relative gains and how this might impede cooperation. Collectively, the two articles make an important contribution to our understanding of neoliberal institutionalism in contrast to neorealism, despite neoliberal institutionalism sharing many of neorealism's foundational assumptions. In particular, the analytical discussions help us to understand how each approach conceives the role international institutions can play in international peace and security, especially in instances where relative gains considerations pose a hindrance to interstate cooperation. In The False Promise, Mearsheimer sets up the context for this discussion by providing a sharply distilled understanding of the neo-realist worldview, including its founding assumptions and the rather bleak outlook it produces for state behaviour in the international system. This behaviour may include interstate cooperation, but always hindering cooperation will be two things: considerations for relative gains and fears around cheating. The role of institutions in this worldview is also quite limited, seeing that they are simply a reflection of the distribution of power within the international system and therefore reflect the interests of those most powerful. For example, Mearsheimer argues that although NATO may have helped fend off World War III and helped the West emerge victorious in the Cold War, it was basically a reflection of the distribution of power during that period. And it was the balance of power, and not NATO per se, that provided the key to maintaining stability on the continent. This means that for Mearsheimer, the balance of power within the international system determines whether or not there will be war or peace in the world at any given moment in time. Institutions are just intervening variables in the grand mix of power and interests. This is why the question of relative gains is the most important one for realists when it comes to interstate cooperation. As Mearsheimer explains it, when states are concerned about absolute gains, that is, how much they stand to benefit through cooperation, irrespective to how much other states may gain in comparison, they are most interested in maximising the size of the metaphorical pie and ensuring that they get a bigger piece of the pie as it expands. However, when states are concerned with relative gains, they are also bothered about how much bigger or smaller their piece of the pie is compared to what's being dished out to other states. Mearsheimer accuses institutionalists of overlooking the relative gains question, which he argues can be critical when it comes to matters of military security, as it can mean the difference between a state being able to protect itself from military aggression by another state or be destroyed by it. Instead, he insists that institutionalism is predominantly interested in focusing on how rules can help discourage states from cheating when it comes to cooperation, primarily in the economic realm. Keohane and Martin strongly disagree with this assessment of liberal institutionalism and make at least three important general points about institutionalism to counter Mearsheimer's claims. First, they point out that unlike realism, which only seems to want to offer generalizations without specifying the conditions that facilitate interstate cooperation, institutionalism actually tries to identify the conditions under which institutions can matter and help facilitate interstate cooperation. They don't deny that power distribution and state interests matter, but point out that institutions work in conjunction with these factors to have an impact. Moreover, this impact can vary depending on the constellation of power and interests. Second, Keohane and Martin clarify that, contrary to Mearsheimer's claim, institutionalist theory is quite relevant to questions of security because of the information providing role played by institutions. After all, it is realists who point out how states can never be sure about the intentions of the other states, so they end up making policy decisions based on worst-case scenarios. But if they have access to information about the intentions of other states and the broader context within which they have to make policy choices, they are better placed to make policy decisions that are more rewarding. So, to Keohane and Martin, there is no question of the relevance of institutionalism to security issues. Third, the authors argue that relative gains considerations are very much a part of the institutionalist research agenda, although these considerations need to be considered more extensively in the literature. Two questions are most important in this regard. One, where do relative gains matter to the prospect of interstate cooperation? And two, what role can institutions play when relative gains do matter? For realists, relative gains can make cooperation difficult or even impossible. For institutionalists, this is not the case. As Keohane and Martin argue, institutions can provide an important coordinating mechanism for sharing information and help clarify and manage concerns around distributional issues. So really, when it comes to relative gains issues, institutions matter all the more for their potential in mitigating such concerns. Institutionalists don't dispute the idea that international institutions are grounded in the constellation of power and interests in global politics. For Keohane and Martin, this is pretty obvious. But, they ask Mearsheimer, if institutions hardly matter, then why is it that states, rational beings that they are, spend valuable time and resources creating them and engaging in institutions if they don't have an impact? For them, answers to this question can be found in examining how the rules that institutions impose on member states influence state behaviour, encouraging short-term sacrifices for long-term gains, and generating a range of impacts that help bring about cooperation.